The LSAT's about to get a whole lot harder for a lot of people out there. I'm going to share with you today what to study, what not to study, given the coming changes. For those who don't know me, my name is Steve Schwartz. I've been teaching the LSAT since 2005, almost 20 years now. I personally brought my LSAT score from a 152 to a 175 on LSAT test day itself. I majored in political science. Humanities was my thing. I hated logic games. It was my worst section of the LSAT at first. Later, it became my best section. And this is pretty typical, actually. Students who score 170 or above on the LSAT typically, historically, have gotten perfect on logic games, maybe -1, and they're losing most of their points on each of the other sections, namely logical reasoning and reading comp. Thing is, of course, after the June LSAT, logic games is no longer on the test. Instead, LSAT is replacing it with a second scored logical reasoning section. So for those taking the LSAT in August or beyond this year, you're going to have no more logic games, 2 scored logical reasoning sections, and 1 scored reading comprehension section. This means, of course, don't study logic games. It won't be on your test if you're taking the LSAT in August or beyond. Instead, you want to devote all the extra time to logical reasoning instead, since it'll be 2/3 of the test. Any gains or improvements you make in logical reasoning will be doubled across the 2 sections. So don't study logic games, instead, more logical reasoning. The thing is, you don't just want to avoid logic games, you also want to avoid the question types that don't show up that frequently. I can't tell you how many students come to me saying, I hate parallel reasoning questions. Can you give me some tips on those? And my question to these students is, why are you asking me about parallel reasoning questions when there's only a couple of those per test? You're also getting a lot of necessary assumption questions wrong, and those are far more common. In fact, I recently spoke with a student. I'm going to call her Jamie, not her real name, but hey, Jamie, quote unquote, if you're out there, this one's for you. Jamie was asking me about parallel flaw questions. I looked at her analytics and I saw that yes, her accuracy rate on parallel flaw questions was low, but of course, this is one of the most rare question types. Her accuracy was also pretty low, although not as low on flaw questions, and flaw questions are far more common. In fact, they are one of the most common types of logical reasoning questions. And so when we think about what's going to give you the biggest bang for your buck in terms of time invested, it's not going to be making a small improvement at parallel flaw questions or even a big improvement at parallel flaw questions, because let's say you go from getting 1 out of 2 parallel flaw questions right to getting 2 out of 2 of them right. You only increased your raw score by 1 point. Instead, if you go from getting 5 out of 8 flaw questions correct to getting 7 or 8 out of 8 flaw questions correct, you're getting 2 or 3 additional raw score points instead of only 1 additional raw score point. All questions on the LSAT are worth the same, so it doesn't make sense to focus on rare question types or harder question types if they don't show up that often. We want to focus on what's going to be the lowest hanging fruit that will also give you the biggest impact in improving your LSAT score. So takeaways for you here, of course, don't study logic games. Instead, study the most common logical reasoning question types that give you trouble. The 3 most common are necessary assumption, inference, and flaw. The 3 most common out of the roughly 15 types of logical reasoning questions. The least common types are parallel, parallel flaw, and evaluate the argument. In fact, evaluate the argument questions only show up once every several exams. Same with cannot be true questions. They don't show up that frequently. So when you're analyzing your mistakes in terms of what you're getting wrong, you don't want to look at just your accuracy percentage as a whole. You also want to look at the portion of these questions or the frequency with which these questions show up on the LSAT. And that, by the way, is numbers versus percentages reasoning, which actually is important on the LSAT and becoming increasingly important with the removal of the logic games section. We've gotten some early indications based on logical reasoning experimental sections over the past 6 months or so, that indications that LSAT is likely to increase the relative proportion of questions involving this method of reasoning on the LSAT going forward. This is, of course, not some radical new type of logical reasoning question, but rather just more of the same quantitative-based reasoning questions we've been seeing on the LSAT over the past several years. If you'd like my help in improving on logical reasoning or any other area of the LSAT, reading comprehension as well, not games, since there's no more games, you can check out the links below this video to book a call with me and my team. We'd be glad to help you out. In the meantime, I wish you all the best and take care.